famous timber merchant in Nyali, who incorporated a company together with his wife. So 2 directors, 2 shareholders. And at some point, the farmer decided to marry a second wife. And the farmer decided that he wanted to build a house for this second wife. And I went to those sites last weekend, so I know they build timber houses. And CS, I saw the timber houses. So he decided that he wanted to build a house for his second wife, and he needed timber to do that. And he said, I'm going to use the timber that we have. And he actually did that. And his wife took him, his first wife, took him to court and said, you cannot do that. And he said, why? And she said, well, this needs to be a company decision. The board of directors needs to meet and make the decision to allow you to use that timber. And in court, the famous argument was this: kampuni yangu, bibi, timber je. So, kuna shida gani? So, that really underpins the issue of corporate governance. The fact that once you incorporate a company, it is no longer you. It is a different legal entity which must subscribe to certain codes or certain practices of governance, because it's not just about you. It is not the way you wake up in the morning and decide to bet. No. Companies have to be governed using certain rules and using certain agreed processes and procedures that will safeguard the investment of the shareholders. Now, in my presentation this morning, I will talk about professional standards and codes of governance, why we need to have them. I will then briefly look at the countries that have particularly the codes of corporate governance. Then I will speak a little bit about Kenya, and then I will go into common themes with regard to some of the codes of governance that we have around. And then I will zero in on the ICPSK Code of Governance for Private Organizations, which some of you may have. Those of you who have not purchased a copy, the CEO has told me that the Institute is taking orders. So if you do wish to have a copy of the Code of Corporate Governance for Private Organizations, please do purchase a copy from the Institute. Now, the beauty about being asked to speak in a topic that is very open-ended is you make it what you want it to be. So when you look at the topic I have, it's quite open-ended. What do I say about professional standards? And what do I say about codes of corporate governance? So I will make it what I think it ought to be. Now, I'll start off by professional standards. And what is professional standards? Professional standards are basically agreed standards of behavior, agreed standards of measure for certain behavior relevant to a particular profession. As an institute, we do have a mandate to develop professional standards. And these professional standards reflect the values of the institute, reflect the values of the profession, and clarify to members what standards of behavior are expected of them. They also represent the criteria against which stakeholders measure the performance of certain professionals. And the primary purpose of professional codes or professional standards is really to promote corporate governance. And I'm talking about corporate governance because we're talking about the Institute. If we were speaking about professional standards for medical personnel, perhaps we will be talking about something else. Now, the Institute does have a mandate, like I said, to develop professional standards. And the following standards have actually been developed by the Institute. The first is a standard on general meetings. And basically what this standard does is it sets out how general meetings should be held, what sort of notices need to be given, who should attend, who should chair, etc. Then we have the second standard, which is the role of the corporate secretary in corporate governance. We also have a standard on the corporate seal or the company seal. How and in what circumstances should the seal be used? Who should have custody of the seal? And how should it be accounted for to the board? The last standard which the Institute has developed is a standard on meetings of the board of directors. And like I said, the main purpose of those standards is to promote the practice of good corporate governance. Now, what about corporate governance codes? Corporate governance codes are a set of principles of good corporate governance and standards that deal with how an organization is managed by its board, how it is governed by its board. So the codes will set out the role and responsibilities of the board, the role of management, how meetings should be held, and so on and so forth. But what's about corporate governance? And I've put there what I think is basically what the corporate governance framework is. So corporate governance encompasses all those matters that you see on your screen up there. The board of directors, how is the board appointed? What about the term of office? What about remuneration? What about board committees? What are the responsibilities of the board committees? What mandates do board committees have? It deals with the mission, vision, and strategy of the organization. It deals with the hierarchy in the organization, etc., so on and so forth. So basically, it will deal with all those topics that you see on your screen. In a nutshell, therefore, corporate governance codes would basically deal with the authority within an organization. How is that authority exercised? By whom? In what circumstances? It will deal with decision making. How is the decision making process within an organization? It will deal with accountability. Who is the board accountable to? Who is management accountable to? And how are these people held to account? And he talked about the benefits of good corporate governance. But basically, good corporate governance means better oversight and accountability of organizations. It means improved decision making, better compliance and less conflict, increased operational efficiency, stimulates performance, and improves risk management. Now, when developing codes of corporate governance, it is always important to ask the question, why are we doing this? Why do we have to have a code of corporate governance? And the picture I have on the screen is, you see, is that a chicken or a pork? Chicken. And it wants to, it's a pork. It wants to cross the road. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, why does it want to cross the road? Because it wants to collect its shuttlecock across the road. So for us, when we are developing codes of corporate governance, the question is, why are we doing it? Are we doing it simply because we want to be like everybody else who has a code of corporate governance, who has professional standards? What is the burning platform? What is driving it? Because once you understand what the burning platform is, then you develop a code of corporate governance that is fit for purpose, that addresses your particular circumstances and addresses the problem that you're trying to cure. Have we seen this? Is it familiar? Who has been in an AGM that has turned out like that? You have the shareholders there, and they have come during this AGM, and what are they doing? They have a poisoned arrow, and this is most likely the chairman. I didn't say chair lady, I said chairman. and this case is right, isn't it? This chairman has actually taken cover. You can see the board. And the board has also taken cover. Because the shareholders have arrived during an AGM. I think we have seen this, or at least read about some of these happenings at AGMs. Is that the Kenya Meat Commission? We have a big room here that is sweeping off the board. But we have a few people left here. So I think for me this picture spoke about the Kenya Meat Commission. And the question is, why do we have to go through this type of thing? And this, to me, tells me or gives me the reason why we need codes of corporate governance. Because if you just simply remove the directors and bring a new lot without proper systems, without proper procedures, without any guidance, these directors are going to fall in exactly the same hole that the initial directors fell in. So you definitely need guidance to these directors, and many times you will actually find that directors find themselves on the wrong side of the law because they did not know. Now, unfortunately, our law has no place for I did not know. So before you know what has hit you, you're doing time somewhere else. Now, who has codes of corporate governance? And from the slide you have before you, you will realize that very many countries across the world have codes of corporate governance. And even Kenya is not left behind. We have Kenya here. We have various codes of corporate governance. We're not reinventing any wheel here. I have specifically put in red just some countries that I would like us to speak a little bit about. South Africa there. I'm sure you have heard of King 1, King 2, and the most famous of them all, King 3. And King 3 has really become an international benchmark in terms NGOs, and to the public sector as well. King did really revolutionize corporate governance. We also have Brazil. Brazil over here. Brazil with its Nova Mercado, if some of you have heard about it. This is a voluntary code of corporate governance for those companies which are listed on the stock exchange. And those companies that subscribe to that code do it on a voluntary basis and earn certain benefits. But what is key to note about the Brazilian case is the fact that those companies that subscribe to the Nova Mercado have actually stated that they have seen an improvement in their performance, financial-wise and otherwise, that they seem to produce better results as opposed to those companies that do not subscribe to that code. Then we have the OECD, and I'll speak a little bit more about the OECD in the next slide. But we have the UK, the combined code of the UK. Again, setting place very good standards in terms of good corporate governance. So, very many countries across the world have codes of corporate governance that they ask directors of boards to subscribe to. Now, what about Kenya? In Kenya, we have various industry codes. The Capital Markets Authority, starting at the bottom there, did issue the CMA Corporate Governance Guidelines in 2002, and Paul spoke about a new initiative where we are trying to have a code in place to replace the 202 guidelines. We have the Central Bank of Kenya Prudential Guidelines of 2013, and then we have the IRA Corporate Governance Guidelines of 2011. When I looked at the research around codes of corporate governance, I found that very many countries put codes in place around the year 2010. And I asked myself, what was so peculiar about the year 2010? And I think I don't want to give you the answer. I want you to do a bit of research just to find out why is it that so many countries were clamoring to have codes of corporate governance then. Then, in Kenya as well, we have various corporate codes, and I just put there the Equity Bank Group Code of Corporate Governance by way of an example. But there are very many companies that have in place very good codes of corporate governance. And I think it's important that we start to speak about these initiatives in Kenya, because we should not think that it's just in 2014 that we're waking up to develop codes of corporate governance. No, they have always been there. I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, why haven't we seen the benefit of implementing some of these codes? I think that should be the question we should be asking. Then we have the ICPSK Code of Corporate Governance for private organizations in Kenya, which was launched in May of this year. And again, in my presentation, I'll speak a little bit more about this code later on. What about the government? Are there any initiatives you are aware of with regard to corporate governance? For the government, anyone who knows any initiatives we have within the government? The Constitution, yes indeed, the Constitution. And you will find that a lot of the codes that are going to be developed will be based on the values of the Constitution. Because the Constitution indeed sets a very good base for all the things we speak about. When we speak about diversity on boards, we are basically just talking about what the Constitution has in place. The OECD principles have actually become international benchmarks for those countries and organizations that want to put in place codes of corporate governance. The first principle is ensuring the basis for an effective corporate governance framework. The second principle is the rights of shareholders and key ownership functions. The third is the equitable treatment of shareholders. The fourth, the role of stakeholders. The fifth, disclosure and transparency. And the last one, the responsibilities of the board. You will find that when you read through most of the codes of corporate governance, they all rotate around these principles. They rotate around these principles that were set in, that were put up by the OECD. All codes really just rotate around these principles. Now, I want to move on and talk a little bit about the common themes in codes of corporate governance that have been developed across the world, including the ones that have been developed in Kenya, and I want to specifically speak about the ICPSK Code of Corporate Governance, the draft CMA Code, and there is also a draft Code of Corporate Governance for government-owned entities, which the Institute has helped develop. One of the key things that runs across various codes of corporate governance is that sustainability has gained momentum. And when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the triple bottom line approach. That is people, planet, and profit. That equals sustainability. In other words, we don't just focus on the financial performance of an organization. We focus also on what that organization is doing in the environment, how is it looking after the environment, and how is it looking after the people that either work for it or associate with it. I work for Shell. You've had a lot of stories about Shell in Nigeria. So when you think about Shell, you also think about how is it responsible for the environment in which it finds itself. We now speak about tallow in Kenya. And we will be holding tallow responsible, not just the board of tallow responsible, not just for the financial results that it will deliver, but how it is going to treat the people and the environment around where it finds itself. That is the importance of the triple bottom line approach. The 3 Ps must balance for there to be sustainability. The second thing that is really important and runs through all codes is integrated reporting. So we are not just interested in how a board is delivering results. We are also interested in knowing how those results have been delivered. What is the other relevant information that we need to know with regards to the results that an organization has delivered? So there is greater content for performance. So you don't just see numbers, but you also see the reason behind the delivery of those numbers. The other thing that you will find common in codes of corporate governance is corporate social responsibility. Some people now prefer to call it corporate social investment. The key message that you find in all those codes is that performance must be balanced with responsibility to the environment in which the corporate entity finds itself. So, if an organization is polluting the environment, it must clean up. It must also be held to account in terms of what is it doing for the community around it. Corporate social responsibility. What budget does it have for corporate social responsibility? What is its strategy? It must have a strategy on corporate social responsibility. We had a very interesting discussion with staff when we were developing the code of governance for government-owned GOEs. And they said to us, we must specify the budget, because this is one area where we find that a lot of the money is wasted through corrupt deals. And we said, what do you mean? He said, oh no, you'll find boards have printed t-shirts, and all those t-shirts end up in one board. Is to have in place a strategy and an agreed budget with regards to corporate social responsibility or investment. The other common theme is risk management and internal controls. And I must tell you a story about risk management. When we were finalizing the code of corporate governance for ICPSK, I happened to sit at lunch at a table that CS Jomangi Butia, CS Jomangi Butia, please raise your hand, and CS Rafael Mai, as well as CS Ogutha was seated. And this gentleman had an interesting discussion on risk management. And CS Jomangi Butia and CS Mai were advising CS Ogutha about risk management in old age for men. And they said, as you grow older, you must make sure that even if your house is not mortgaged, it appears to be mortgaged. You must also make sure that the managing director in your house knows that that house is mortgaged, and in fact, on certain months, you must pretend to borrow some money from the kitchen to pay for that mortgage. So I asked them, why so? Why must you do that? Why must you go to the extent of even pretending that you have mortgaged your house? They say, you know what? There is something called removing the stamp. I'm told certain communities know what removing the stamp is. That when a man grows old and he has produced all the wealth that he can never produce, you remove him. So, according to these two gentlemen, CSY and CS, the risk mitigation strategy is you must pretend to be very indebted, so much so that removing you means problems for the managing director. And in fact, I remember they went further and said, you must clearly tell the managing director that your mortgage is not insured for some reason. So that if you die, she'll be called upon to pay, and that the insurance company will not step in. they must have a risk management strategy, they must have a risk management framework, they must have or agree a risk appetite, how far they can go with regard to risk, how much risk they can take. They must then have a risk management strategy. How do they manage their risk? Internal controls. And stakeholders should demand or hold companies or boards accountable for risk management and internal controls. Because you can work so hard, but all the revenue that you generate is lost simply because you haven't managed your risks properly or you do not have proper internal controls. So risk management and internal controls is a key thing in all the codes that we surveyed. Now, an effective board. That is another key thing in all the codes that we surveyed. Now, these gentlemen and ladies are having a board meeting. And the chairman then says, it is settled. We put out a press release saying we cannot remember what we decided. Isn't that an effective board? Do you think it is? No. No. So codes of corporate governance are requiring that organizations have effective boards. Boards that effectively carry out their role of being stewards of the assets which have been placed in their hands to manage. Now, the other thing that we found in most codes that we surveyed is that there are certain tools that boards ought to have which will help them in becoming an effective board. One of those is a board charter, that each board must have what is called a board charter that sets out their roles and responsibilities, that sets out how their role is different from that of management, that sets out their values, that sets out how they manage their meetings, how meetings are held, etc. The other tool that each board must have is a work plan. A work plan that sets out the activities of the board for an entire year, so that you avoid situations where the chairman simply wakes up and decides, oh, today we are going to do this. Actually, I want to implement a board work plan in my house. And as the managing director, I'm going to drive it. And the chairman has to agree. Because these chairmen have a way of just waking up and deciding this company is leaving the country today, which is very it destabilizes people. So, even in your houses, even in your homes, try and have a family work plan. It helps. It helps in terms of planning, it helps in terms of allocating resources, etc. The other tools that boards of directors need to have is how can they make their committees effective. I think my site is failing me. Let me try and look. Board evaluation, yes. That boards should have a board evaluation mechanism, and boards should also have a code of conduct and ethics that they subscribe to. Another common thing in the codes of corporate governance that we surveyed is the whistleblowing. I think some of you may have read the story of a whistleblower. I think about 2 weeks ago, a whistleblower who was then found dead somewhere. Now, those two gentlemen are sleeping on the streets. And the first one is telling the other one how he has lost his family, etc. And this second one is basically saying the reason why he is on the street is he blew the whistle. And this is a reality in most organizations, that people who speak up about the things that are going wrong in that organization find themselves either out or find themselves in situations where they never assumed they would ever be. So whistleblowing is becoming quite critical, and you will find that in the codes that we have drafted, for ICPSK for example, we have provided that each board must have a whistleblowing policy that protects whistleblowers, so that people feel empowered to speak up about anything which is going wrong in the organization. So let's work together and speak up against anything that is going wrong. The other thing that we have found in all the codes that we surveyed is the governance audit. The governance audit. And I don't think I need to speak too much about the governance audit, because as members of the Institute, you no doubt are aware about the governance audit. And this is a meeting which is going on, and the chairman says, "Gentlemen, ladies, I propose we take a short break, during which we then hold our meeting." I'm sure you have heard about this. And I sit on another board, the Women on Boards Network, and this is a common complaint from the ladies, that they find that the meeting never takes place within the meeting. Yes? The meeting takes place elsewhere. At night, in the clubs, in the gyms, perhaps. So that by the time the ladies are coming to ask questions, they are looked at like they are asking stupid questions, because the men already moved on. They had that discussion elsewhere. Yeah? So, the governance audit will be looking at some of these things. How is the meeting conducted? Are people allowed to ask questions? Or are meetings happening elsewhere and the board simply comes to rubber stamp what has been decided? So that's a common one. But I must say that you will not find the governance audit in codes. For example, the UK code, you will not find it there. You will not find it in Brazil. You will only find it in India. You will not even find it in King Creek. You will find it in India, and I think now Kenya will be the next country where you find us promoting the governance audit as a way of ensuring proper corporate governance. Now, the other one, which is truly an innovation from Kenya, is the legal and compliance audit. And the legal and compliance audit simply looks at the state of, or the legal health of the organization. And this is something we have included in the ICPSK code, that we are requiring organizations to subject themselves to a legal audit to be sure that they have the license to operate. The other common one is the role of the company secretary. And you'll find that the codes will set out the role of the company secretary very clearly. And I'm happy to say that the ICPSK code has set out that role very clearly. King 3 has set out that role very, very clearly, and therefore, in all the codes where we have been involved in, we have made suggestions that the role of the Corporation Secretary is clearly set out. And the Corporation Secretary is actually a trusted friend of the board. And the board should trust the Corporation Secretary. I chaired a certain board where when I went, I joined that organization. The first meeting we had, the MD then said, we have a matter to discuss on management, and I would therefore like everybody, including the Corporation Secretary, to walk out. And I said, okay, does this have to do specifically with the Corporation Secretary? And he said, no. It is a disciplinary issue about 2 members of management. And I struggled to understand why the Corporation Secretary was being asked to leave, when the Corporation Secretary is the one who ought to be guiding the board in exercising their role in some of these things. So it struck me that the role of the Corporation Secretary was not understood, and therefore there is an opportunity for us to make sure that that role is clearly understood. Now, the other thing that we found in all the codes is transparency and disclosure on the affairs of the organization. That the board of directors is required to set out certain disclosures, and I think this is where, for example, the Capital Markets Authority has led the way. You no doubt have started seeing some time back companies publishing their results, their quarterly results, half-year results, etc. That's part of disclosure. So we are now asking boards of directors to disclose a number of things, including financials, remuneration for directors, term limits if they have them, their policy on a number of issues, including the code of conduct, etc. So full disclosure is a key thing in codes of corporate governance. The other thing, I'm not sure that it's honorable, no, His Excellency Nyali is in this room. That sounded like is that stakeholders are becoming critical. Therefore, boards of organizations are being asked, first and foremost, to make sure they have done a stakeholder mapping and that they manage stakeholders effectively. Now, I just want to spend a minute or two on this next slide, which is on whether codes are applied or rather are implemented on a comply or explain basis, comply or else basis, or apply or explain basis. So there are basically 3 ways in which you can implement codes. The first of which is comply or else, which means I set out a code that I expect you to comply with, and if you don't comply, there is a sanction. Of course, the laws are like that. You apply it, or else you get a sanction. Now, codes of corporate governance have moved away from the comply or else basis and have moved to comply or explain. For example, the UK code is on a comply or explain model, which is principle-based. In other words, you comply with the standards which are set out in the code, but if you are unable to comply, you then explain why you're not complying. There is also the apply or explain basis, which is very similar to the comply or explain. King 3 is on an apply or explain basis. So King 3 basically says apply standards which are set out, understand the issue, the corporate governance standard, then apply it. And if you're not going to apply it, explain the reason why. This is in recognition of the fact that some companies may actually be applying a higher standard, so you don't ask them to come lower. You ask them to explain why they haven't complied, which is perhaps they're actually at a higher standard. So most codes, you will find that most codes are either on the comply or explain model, or like PIN3, apply or explain model. The two are very similar, but most countries go with comply or explain. Now, other things which are covered, other themes in codes, term limits. We are now starting to see term limits. The GOE code is going to propose 2 terms of 3 years each. The ICPSK code has set out term limits as well, 2 terms. And we believe that this is good governance, that it is always good to inject new blood and new experience into an organization. There is also an emphasis on board independence, that the board is not held hostage by certain other interests, that board members must exercise independence in performing their role. There is also a very important issue of induction and skills development, and one of the proposals we have made is that each board must be inducted in their role, and each board member must undergo a certain number of hours. Just the same way ICPSK requires us to do CPDs, that board members are going to be required to undertake a number of hours in corporate governance per year. Succession planning, critical, that we should have a succession plan, not just for the CEO, which is very common, but for board members as well. I'm associated with a company I know which has had board members for a very long time. And what tends to happen is that they think in the same way they thought 10 years ago. There is no new thinking, and that is what succession plan does. It allows you to inject new thinking into an organization. The concept of separation of roles is also critical, and we are setting out the separations of roles between board and management, chairman and CEO, and secretary and CEO. As the chairman mentioned, I think it's now accepted within public policy that the role of the CEO will be separated from that of the secretary, which is critical to us. One of the issues we faced when we were discussing with the government was, but what does this secretary do? Because they're so used to the CEO acting as both the CEO and the secretary. And so we had to explain that the CEO really has a separate role which is quite separate from that of the secretary. And then the importance of minority shareholders, that boards must make sure that they safeguard the interests of minority shareholders. Now, I come down to the ICPSK Code of Corporate Governance, and the code is divided into 8 chapters. The first talks about the board of directors. The second is transparency and disclosure. The third is accountability, risk management, and internal controls. And then the fourth is ethical leadership and corporate citizenship, shareholder rights and obligations, stakeholder relationships, sustainability, performance management, and then lastly, compliance with laws and regulations. I'm made to understand that the Institute is taking orders, so if you wish to purchase a copy of the code, please let the Secretariat know. In terms of the Board of Directors, those are all the subjects that we have looked at in that code. We looked at the appointment, composition and size, the role and functions of the board, term limits, the liability of the board, and so on and so forth. So basically, the code has provided for all these subjects prestigious to be appointed onto a board, but not so prestigious to walk into a cell without your shoes. So it's an important area to pay attention to when you're requested to become a director. Always ask yourself, what liability am I exposing myself to? Under transparency and disclosure, again, those are the matters we have discussed there. We are basically asking the board of directors to disclose all these matters, including the remuneration structure. This was a very contentious area because at first we had suggested that boards should declare the remuneration of each board member by name. And as we all know, even those of us who sit on boards of state corporations, and we know that the going rate is 20,000 taxed down to 14, we still don't want it declared that Catherine earned 14,000. So, it's a very contentious area, but we're still asking that the remuneration structure should be declared to all the stakeholders. Another key area is procurement. That the organization should disclose some of the top procurement within the organization, because again, over our history, there has been a lot of issues around procurement. The next chapter talks about accountability, risk management, and internal controls. And we have talked about financial reporting, risk management, internal controls, etc., so on and so forth. So that is what is covered under Chapter 3 of the Code. Under Chapter 4, ethical leadership and corporate citizenship, we have talked about ethics and integrity. We have talked about the requirement to have a code of conduct and ethics. We've talked about conflict of interest. We've talked about corporate reputation and image, whistleblowing, and corporate social responsibility and investment. Then Chapter 5 covers shareholder obligations, ownership rights and interests, minority shareholders, etc. Now, Chapter 6 talks about stakeholders, and we ask that boards recognize, identify who their stakeholders are, and have a strategy for managing each of the stakeholders. Then Chapter 7 talks about sustainability and performance management. I think this is an issue that particularly shareholders are very interested in, because they want to know how viable their organization is in the future. And we want to imagine that these are the shareholders. If it is the GOEs, this would be His Excellency the President saying, no excuses, give me great performance. So sustainability is an issue, and we provided for it there. And then the last chapter is on applicable laws, regulations, and standards, and how we interface with the Constitution. Every organization should have a compliance strategy and the legal compliance audit. I want to end by sharing with you this. This was a criminal, and he has been dragged before a court of law. So the prosecutor is asking him, how could you swindle those good people who trusted you? And his answer is so simple. You cannot swindle people who don't trust you. But isn't that the truth? If they trust you, you can swindle them, isn't it? But if they don't trust you, how do you do it? You cannot swindle people who don't trust you. They trust you so much that they don't look beyond what you're telling think that sums up what corporate governance is. Boards of directors ought to be trusted by all stakeholders, shareholders, employees, the government, the community, etc. And therefore, boards of directors, because they are trusted by all these people, they should not start swindling the organizations. Thank you very much.